Room 816, Sands Hotel, Las Vegas. October 23, 1957. Frank Sinatra wasn't supposed to be there. He had a party waiting for him, celebrities and executives expecting his presence. But he'd heard something through the hotel ventilation system. An old man singing, badly out of tune, voice breaking with pain. Frank grabbed his guitarist and went looking. When he found room 816, he didn't knock loud. He knew whoever was inside was fragile. The man who answered was 82 years old, dying, and had traveled across America for one reason. What Frank did in the next 3 hours was never reported, never photographed, never publicized. Until now. Before I share this incredible story with you, if you want to discover the most touching moments from the golden era of entertainment, real stories of humanity, and the unknown sides of legends from the 1950s through 1980s, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the story I'm going to tell you today isn't just about a singer and a veteran. It's about respect, gratitude, and a promise kept across 2 wars and 40 years. Thomas Crawford's story began not in Las Vegas, but in Normandy, France. June 6, 1944. D-Day. Thomas was a 29-year-old sergeant in the 1st Infantry Division. He'd landed on Omaha Beach in the second wave at 6:15 in the morning. Of the 42 men in his unit, 17 made it off the beach alive. Thomas was one of them. He spent the next 11 months fighting across France, Belgium, and into Germany. He saw things no man should see. Lost friends whose names he still whispered every night before sleep. When the war ended in May 1945, Thomas Crawford returned to America as a decorated veteran. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Silver Star for Valor. But the medals sat in a drawer. He never wore them. Never talked about the war. Not to his wife. Not to his children. Not to anyone. Thomas worked as a mechanic in Topeka, Kansas. He fixed cars, lived quietly, raised 3 children. His wife, Margaret, knew not to ask about the war. She'd tried once, in 1946, shortly after he returned. Thomas had looked at her with such pain in his eyes that she never asked again. But Margaret noticed something. Every night, after dinner, Thomas would sit in his garage with an old radio, and he'd listen to music. Specifically, he'd listen to Frank Sinatra. Frank's voice did something to Thomas that nothing else could. It calmed the nightmares. It quieted the memories. When Frank sang, Thomas could breathe. Margaret would sometimes stand at the garage door, watching her husband sit perfectly still, tears running down his face, listening to a voice on the radio that somehow reached the broken parts of his soul. Thomas had a favorite song. It was called I'll Walk Alone, recorded by Frank in 1944. The song was about separation, loneliness, waiting for someone to return. For Thomas, it wasn't just a song. It was Omaha Beach. It was the friends who didn't make it home. It was every promise he'd made to dying men in foxholes. Every time he heard it, he cried. And every time, the crying helped. In 1954, Thomas was diagnosed with lung cancer. The doctors said it was from the war, chemical exposure, smoke inhalation during combat. By 1957, the cancer had spread to his bones. The doctors gave him months, maybe weeks. Thomas was 82 years old. He'd lived a long life. He'd raised good children. He'd been a faithful husband. But he had one regret. He'd never thanked Frank Sinatra. It sounds simple, maybe even foolish. Thank a singer for making records? But for Thomas Crawford, Frank's voice had been a lifeline. For 13 years, that voice had kept him sane, kept him human, kept him from drowning in memories of war. And Thomas wanted to say thank you. In person. One time. Before he died. In September 1957, Thomas saw an advertisement in a newspaper. Frank Sinatra was beginning a residency at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. Shows every night for 6 weeks. Thomas made a decision. He told his wife, I'm going to Las Vegas. I need to hear Frank sing one more time. Margaret was terrified. Thomas, you can barely walk. The doctors said you shouldn't travel. You could die on the road. Then I'll die trying, Thomas said quietly. I've waited 13 years. I'm not waiting anymore. Margaret couldn't stop him. She knew that look in his eyes. It was the same look he'd had when he enlisted in 1943, the look that said some things are worth dying for. So she helped him pack. She gave him their savings, $217. She kissed him goodbye, and she prayed he'd come home alive. Thomas Crawford left Topeka, Kansas on October 18, 1957. He drove himself, 1,200 miles. His body was failing, the pain constant, but he drove through it. He stopped every few hours to rest, sleeping in his car, eating crackers and water. It took him 4 days. 4 days of agony. But on October 22nd, he arrived in Las Vegas. The Sands Hotel was the most glamorous place Thomas had ever seen. Neon lights, beautiful people, wealth everywhere. He felt out of place in his worn suit and tired body. But he walked to the front desk and asked for a room. One night. $127, including tax. It was nearly everything he had. But he paid it. Room 816. 8th floor. Thomas had planned it carefully. Frank's show started at midnight. Thomas would rest in his room during the evening, gather his strength, then go downstairs at 11:30 and find a seat. After the show, he'd try to meet Frank backstage. Maybe he wouldn't get through security. Maybe Frank wouldn't have time. But at least Thomas would have tried. At least he would have heard Frank sing live one last time. But the plan fell apart almost immediately. By 7 in the evening, Thomas was in severe pain. The travel had destroyed him. His back felt like it was breaking. His lungs burned with every breath. He lay on the bed in room 816, unable to move. He'd pushed too hard, come too far, and now his body was shutting down. By 9 o'clock, Thomas knew he wouldn't make it to the show. He could barely sit up. The room felt like it was spinning. He thought about calling the front desk, asking for a doctor. But what could a doctor do? Thomas was dying. He'd known that when he left Kansas. He'd just hoped to last one more day. So Thomas lay there, listening to the muffled sounds of the hotel around him. Music drifting up from the casino. Laughter in the hallways. And somewhere, far below, Frank Sinatra was preparing to perform. Thomas would never hear it. He'd traveled 1,200 miles, spent his last money, destroyed his body, and he'd failed. At 11:30, tears were running down Thomas's face. Not from physical pain, though that was immense, but from the crushing disappointment of being so close and yet so impossibly far. Frank Sinatra was in this building, right now, singing, and Thomas was trapped in a room 8 floors above, unable to move, unable to do anything but lie there and accept defeat. Then, around midnight, Thomas did something he hadn't done in years. He sang. His voice was broken, barely a whisper, ruined by cancer and age. But he sang the only song that mattered. I'll Walk Alone. The words came out wrong. The melody was unrecognizable. But he sang it anyway, crying, alone in room 816, singing to an empty room because there was nothing else left to do. He didn't know that the Sands Hotel had an old ventilation system. He didn't know that sound carried through the metal ducts in strange ways. He didn't know that 8 floors below, in a corridor near the backstage area, Frank Sinatra had just finished his first set and was walking to his dressing room when he heard something that made him stop. A voice, faint, barely audible, singing I'll Walk Alone. Badly, painfully, but singing it like it was a prayer. Frank stopped walking. His guitarist, Viola, stopped beside him. You hear that? Frank asked. Al listened. Sounds like someone singing. Upstairs somewhere. Frank looked up at the ceiling, following the sound. It was coming through an air vent. An old man's voice, breaking with emotion, singing Frank's song like it was the last thing he'd ever do. And something about that voice, the pain in it, the desperate sincerity, went straight through Frank's chest. Find out where that's coming from, Frank said. Right now. Hotel staff tracked the sound to the 8th floor. Room 816. Frank took the elevator up with Viola and 2 members of his security team. When they reached the 8th floor, the singing had stopped. The hallway was quiet. Frank walked to room 816 and stood outside the door for a moment, listening. He could hear labored breathing inside. Someone in pain. Frank knocked. Softly, almost gently. There was a long pause. Then a weak voice from inside said, Who's there? My name is Frank, Frank said through the door. Frank Sinatra. I heard you singing. Can I come in? Another long pause. Then the sound of someone moving, very slowly. The door opened, and there stood Thomas Crawford, 82 years old, hollow-cheeked, eyes sunken, wearing a wrinkled white shirt and holding onto the doorframe for support. When he saw Frank Sinatra standing in the hallway, his legs nearly gave out. Mr. Sinatra? Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. That's right, Frank said. I heard you singing downstairs. Through the vents. Can I come in? I'd like to talk to you. Thomas nodded, unable to speak. He stepped back, nearly falling. Frank caught him, gently, and helped him back to the bed. Thomas sat down heavily, staring at Frank like he was seeing a ghost. Frank pulled a chair close to the bed. Viola stood near the door with the guitar. The security team waited in the hallway, and Frank said, very quietly, Sir, what's your name? Thomas Crawford. Where are you from, Thomas? Topeka, Kansas. Frank nodded. That's a long way from Vegas. You come here alone? Yes, sir. To see my show? Thomas nodded. Tears were already forming in his eyes. I wanted to hear you sing. One last time. Before I... He couldn't finish the sentence. Frank understood. He could see it. This man was dying. Maybe days. Maybe hours. How long have you been listening to my music, Thomas? Since 1944. Thomas's voice was shaking. I was at Normandy. D-Day. When I came home, I couldn't deal with it. The memories. The nightmares. But your voice. Mr. Sinatra, your voice saved my life. Every night for 13 years, I've listened to you sing. You got me through the war. You got me through everything after. And I just wanted to say thank you. I just wanted to shake your hand and say thank you before I die. Frank Sinatra had heard many things in his career. Praise from critics, screams from fans, compliments from presidents. But nothing had ever hit him like those words. This man had fought at Normandy, had survived hell, had carried that hell for 13 years. And Frank's voice had helped him bear it. Frank reached out and took Thomas's hand. Mr. Crawford, he said, his voice thick with emotion, the honor is mine. You're a hero, a real hero. And if my music helped you even a little bit, then everything I've ever done was worth it. Thomas was crying now, full, body-shaking sobs. I tried to make it to your show, he said through tears. I drove 4 days. I spent everything I had. But I couldn't, my body gave out. I failed. You didn't fail, Frank said firmly. You made it to Vegas. You're here. And I'm here. So we're going to fix this right now. He looked at Viola. Al, you got your guitar? Al held it up. Always. Frank turned back to Thomas. Mr. Crawford, you didn't make it to my show. So I'm bringing the show to you. What song do you want to hear? Thomas stared at Frank, unable to believe what he was hearing. You're going to sing? Here? For me? That's exactly what I'm going to do, Frank said. So tell me, what song? Thomas didn't hesitate. I'll Walk Alone. Frank nodded. I thought you might say that. He stood up, adjusted his tie, and nodded at Al. Al started playing. And Frank Sinatra, in room 816 of the Sands Hotel, began to sing. Frank sang 6 songs that night. He sang, I'll Walk Alone first, and Thomas cried through every word. Then he sang, In the Wee Small Hours of the Morning. Then One for My Baby. Then, I've Got You Under My Skin. Then, Come Fly With Me. And finally, at Thomas's request, My Way. Even though the song wouldn't be officially recorded for another 11 years. Frank sang it anyway, improvising lyrics, making it up as he went, because Thomas said he'd heard the melody in a dream and always associated it with Frank's voice. Between songs, Frank and Thomas talked. Thomas told stories about D-Day, about the men he'd lost, about the promises he'd made to dying friends. Frank listened to every word. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty platitudes, just listened with the full weight of his attention and respect. At one point, Thomas said, Mr. Sinatra, can I tell you something? Anything. When I was at Omaha Beach, there was a kid in my unit. Private Danny Reeves, 19 years old. From Brooklyn. He loved your music. Had a little photo of you in his helmet. Said when the war was over, he was going to move to New York and try to meet you. Shake your hand. Thomas's voice broke. Danny didn't make it off the beach. He got hit 20 yards from shore. I held him while he died. And his last words were, Tell Sinatra I loved his voice. I never got to tell you. Until now. Frank's eyes were wet. He reached out and gripped Thomas's shoulder. I'm honored, Thomas. Truly honored. And I promise you, Danny's memory will stay with me. I'll carry it. Always. They talked for 3 hours. Frank didn't leave until 4 in the morning. When he finally stood to go, Thomas tried to stand too, but couldn't. Frank helped him lie back down on the bed. You rest now, Frank said. You've earned it. Mr. Sinatra, Thomas said, his voice barely audible. Thank you. For everything. For the music. For tonight. For listening. Frank shook Thomas's hand one last time. No, sir. Thank you. For your service. For your sacrifice. For everything you and men like you did for this country. I'll never forget this night. I'll never forget you. Then Frank left room 816. He went back downstairs, past the party that was still going, past the celebrities who wanted to talk to him, straight to his suite. He locked the door. And he cried. Not quiet tears. Deep, wrenching sobs. Because he'd just met a man who'd given everything for his country, who'd carried unbearable pain for 13 years, and whose only wish had been to say thank you to a singer. Thomas Crawford died 2 days later. October 25, 1957. He passed away in his sleep in room 816. The hotel staff found him in the morning. There was a smile on his face. The Sands Hotel covered all his expenses: the room, the medical examiner, the transportation of his body back to Kansas. Frank Sinatra paid for it, anonymously. He also paid for Thomas's funeral, and he sent a letter to Thomas's wife, Margaret, though he didn't sign it. The letter said, "Your husband was a hero and a gentleman. It was my honor to know him, even briefly. He will not be forgotten." Margaret Crawford received that letter and knew immediately who'd sent it. But she never told anyone. Not her children, not her friends, not the press. Because the letter had also included a request: please keep this private. Thomas deserved dignity, not publicity. The story stayed secret for 40 years. But in 1997, Thomas's grandson, Michael Crawford, was cleaning out his grandmother's attic after she passed away. He found a diary, Thomas's diary from the war. And tucked inside the diary was a note, written in Thomas's shaking handwriting, dated October 24, 1957, the day before he died. The note said, "Last night, Frank Sinatra came to my room. He sang for me. He listened to me. He treated me like I mattered. I can die in peace now. I kept my promise to Danny. I told Sinatra about him. And Sinatra listened. He really listened. I'm ready to go home." Michael Crawford showed the diary and note to a music historian, who verified the story through hotel records and interviews with Viola, Frank's guitarist. Viola confirmed everything. He remembered that night vividly. "Frank never talked about it," Viola said. "But I saw him cry after. I'd never seen Frank cry before. That veteran, Thomas, he touched something deep in Frank. Changed him, I think." The story was finally published in 1998, a year after Frank Sinatra's death. It became one of the most beloved untold stories of Frank's life, because it revealed something many people knew but couldn't prove: that Frank Sinatra, beneath all the fame and swagger and Hollywood glamour, was a man who understood honor, who respected sacrifice, and who never forgot where he came from or what others had given for his freedom. This story reminds us that true greatness isn't measured by record sales or movie roles or celebrity friends. It's measured in moments like this: a dying veteran in a hotel room, a singer who stopped his party to listen, and 3 hours of music that nobody heard but that changed 2 lives forever. Frank Sinatra had every reason to stay at his party that night. He'd just performed. He was exhausted. Celebrities and industry executives were waiting for him. But he heard an old man singing through a ventilation system, and he chose to follow that voice. Because Frank understood something fundamental: that music isn't about the singer. It's about the listener. And sometimes, the most important performance you'll ever give is the one nobody else will ever hear. Thomas Crawford never made it to Frank's show, but Frank brought the show to him. And in doing so, Frank honored not just Thomas, but every veteran who'd carried invisible wounds, every soldier who'd sacrificed for others, every person who'd ever been saved by a song in their darkest hour. The diary that Michael Crawford found now sits in the Library of Congress. It's part of the Veterans History Project. And tucked inside, along with Thomas's note, is something else: a guitar pick. Viola's guitar pick from that night. Frank had asked Al for it after they left room 816, and Frank had sent it to Thomas's wife along with the anonymous letter. A small token, a memory, proof that it all really happened. And whenever someone asks what kind of man Frank Sinatra really was, those who knew him point to stories like this. Not the headlines, not the scandals, but the quiet moments. The hotel room on the 8th floor. The veteran who traveled 1,200 miles to say thank you. And the singer who stopped everything to listen. That's the Frank Sinatra the world needs to remember.